Okay, I think we're online. Welcome everyone. My name is Rok Kranjc and I'll be the host today for the second installment of our as of yet unnamed new series of online talks convened by Mladi za podnebno pravičnost, or Youth for Climate Justice, a grassroots activist movement based in Slovenia. So we hope to dedicate these sessions to a broader, more general audience, bringing guests and to together use this current situation, however we may frame it, as a point of departure for collective sense-making, envisioning, and strategy building and solidarity to build the insights and tools to unmake capitalism, or whatever this condition today is, and to co-create the conditions to co-create just futures. And today, I'm very happy to be joined by our main guest today, Saskia Sassen. If some of our audience is not familiar, I think it's very worthwhile to look her up. We've also posted some links to her work in the event, but in any case, I'm also very happy to welcome two co-hosts for this session, Maša Hawlina. She's a member of Ljubljana-based housing cooperative initiative Zadrugator and Institute for Housing and Spatial Studies, and also Klemen Ploštajner, a junior researcher at the Faculty of Social Sciences at University of Ljubljana, where he's currently doing his PhD on political ecology of real estate development in capitalism. And just a little bit of information for our viewers. Our talks will be mostly on Fridays to kick off our weekly Fridays for future protests, which have for the time being moved online. And I know Maša, Klemen, and I are interested also to hear about this angle of activism in times of corona measures as they are in different countries and so on. But I digress. So for starters, as we discussed, Saskia, maybe you could open with, well, some of your opening thoughts in relation to our email exchanges in terms of like, how would we conceptualize like a city as a socio-ecological system in this kind of conditions that we see today.
Right. Well, it's a pleasure to be talking to you, and you have a very good project also going, and every city, big or small, should have these projects, because we can make a difference. And if city after city sort of copies, they copy each other a bit. So if you start a little bit of a revolution, in 15 cities, it's going to be many more. But so sort of for starters, I like to argue that cities are complex systems. They have a lot of very simple components that any member of a city, that any resident of a city can understand. But together, when you put it all together, these are fairly complex systems that depend on each other. And so one has to sort of stand back and say, wow, a city is really a working city is a phenomenal condition. And it is mostly the people who make it phenomenal. Because if people somehow conducted themselves differently from how they mostly conduct themselves, we would be in deep trouble. There would be a site of aggressions, of just no respect for the other, of killings. We have historically had cities that have functioned that way, and of course it destroyed them. So one of the first comments I would make is that we really owe a kind of respect to the capabilities of people from the very poor to the very rich, who can make it somehow work. And part of the reason is that we humans need each other. We need food, we need water, we need light, we need everything. And so we are mutually dependent. And so it becomes a kind of interdependent type of system. And its complexity, I started out saying that cities are complex systems. Its complexity really resides in how a whole multiplicity of very diverse systems, very diverse choices, very diverse preferences, very diverse politics, and the list goes on and on, how that can work together. Now, it also means they are a highly imperfect system. If you have the perfect city, you have a problem. I would say that's not what you want. So that's sort of one kind of issue. Second point, the extraordinary range of cultures, of types of food, of politics. You have some of the worst politics happening in city, racisms and hatreds, and you have some of the best. The fact that in the end, we mostly are not killing each other in a city. We mostly are living together. We mostly interact with all kinds of people that we thought we might not like at all. It doesn't matter because it's a minimalism. If it were maximalism, I think we would be killing each other. But luckily, it is a kind of minimalism. By the way, I should say that when I use the term kill, I don't necessarily mean it always literally, like chopping off your head. That's not necessarily what I have in mind. But, it is it's a kind of way of speaking. Now, a third element, the extraordinary range of types of culture, types of foods, types of politics. Again, you have to stand back and say, we forget the variety, the enormous variety of actors. It could be trucks, people, laws, logistics, a whole variety of things that are all in play every day, 24 hours a day. And mostly it works. Sure, there are traffic jams, there are accidents, there's all of that. What is amazing is it all works. That's quite something. Third or fourth element, not sure where I'm at here. It's a space, and this for me is crucial. It's a space where those without power get to make a history, get to make an economy. It's a local economy. It's a modest economy, but it is an economy and it's their economy. Any major city will have sub-economies, so to speak. And those without power, as I said, they don't just get to make an economy, they get to make a history. Their histories are part of our legacy. If you look at old historical cities, there are two types of actors that simply have always been there. One is the rich and the powerful, and the other is the poor. What often is not present, what often is forgotten, the spaces that often are destroyed and replaced by other spaces are those of the nice middle classes. The middle classes have been around in many different formats for a very long time, but they in a way have left less of a trace than the poor, the neighborhoods of the poor, which now often become historic sort of spaces, and of course the rich. And that's also interesting, that the middle classes appear at some point and they're there with us. But historically speaking, it's the poor and the rich that have the longest histories that we know of. Now, looking at today, one of the alarming trends, I would say, is that we have brilliant minds who have acquired the capacity, the knowledge as to how to make even the most modest housing complex something that they can extract value from. And this is a project that I've now been working on. I've written a few things, you might have seen them. And this is different. This has meant very, very fancy financial instruments, mostly based on algorithmic mathematics. In other words, very advanced formulas and ways of handling, ways of repositioning what is a building, what we see as a building, repositioning that as a set of assets. You lose the building part of it, that you can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell. We now have extraordinarily powerful actors who have made it a point to buy up property, especially big, multi-floors, many floors, etc., for the modest or for the rich families, whatever, and how they can, yes, buy that, use that, but also use all those properties, including the most modest little housing within a large complex of buildings, use that to make them work not as housing, but as asset-backed securities. A very fancy instrument that is a very desirable instrument. And that means that a given property can be bought, sold 15 times in one day. The people who might be living in there don't notice it. But eventually what they might notice is, oh my God, it's now more expensive. Suddenly there is something else that has happened. But a lot of our big properties which have multiple families, both for very rich people and properties that deal with mostly low-income people, they can now command. And again, you have very fancy financial firms that are in this business. And we have a film that you may have seen where we track all of this. The film is called Push. It's the notion is people being pushed out of their housing and replaced by other types of people, you know, the fancying up of what used to be housing for modest people. And I'm thinking mostly of big buildings. I'm not thinking of little singular houses. Now, so one way of putting it is that what we have now is a kind of new mode of grabbing. Grabbing, I don't know if you know this good English term, to grab. It is not elegant, it's not fancy, but it's very real. And the notion that you can also grab housing is actually quite interesting. So we have some very well-known, fancy, terribly fancy financial firms, as I said, that are now buying up that kind of housing. And they use it in two ways. One is as housing. They raise the prices so they make a bit more money, etc. But the other one is that all those housing, those materialities function as assets, a very abstract instrument. So I would argue that the main extractive value that investors can take out of the most simple and most sort of lowest income big housing complexes has to do not with providing housing, it has to do with the surge in the high investment circuit of assets. Assets is what the big investors want. They don't want derivatives. Derivatives are for you and me. A derivative derives its value from something else, and it was a very hot instrument 20 years ago, and today much less so. Today it's for modest investors, you know, and they don't get much out of it. The issue for the high investment circuit is assets that can really function as assets. Housing is one of them. A big housing complex is perfect. So what we see as a housing complex, for them in their systematicity, if you want, it is actually a whole bunch of assets that can buy, sell 25 times in an hour. And they make money every time. They make money. So it is the ultimate, I like to say, extractive sector. Housing, which stands there, it can be very modest. It's very physical. You can't move it. Actually, by algorithmic mathematics, yes, you are moving it. You can move it. You can buy and sell it many times in a given day. So that is sort of the issue, you know, that I am now working on and that I think I want people to be aware of. It is happening at this point only in cities, big cities, rich cities, you know, where you have everything. You have the rich and you have also modest. Whenever you have a rich city, you will also have quite a bit of housing that is for low-income people, the cleaners, you know, the et cetera, that the rich neighborhoods also need. So we are at that point now. And this has been great for the financiers. It has not been good for your traditional middle classes, the modest middle classes, and such. I can keep on talking, but you tell me, maybe you have some questions for me.
Well, I know for a fact, Klemen and Maša have lots of I think, very interesting questions.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just give the word to you guys.
Yeah. I have a question that is really connected to what you were just saying, and also we can connect it with the situation with COVID or coronavirus. That what you were talking is that we have, and in your books you also talk about that we have in the new city the extreme polarization, which is connected to the finances. On one hand, we have this huge financial sector with people who are highly paid, and these people are set and seen as the critical infrastructure of the city, as the main actors in the city, and also they are controlling, they have the most power in the city. While on the other hand, we also have the other critical infrastructure, which is necessary for the global city to function, and it is invisible. So the cleaners, workers, shopping assistants, people like that. And now today's situation of epidemic of coronavirus flipped the situation of visibility. Now the bankers are invisible and unnecessary, and the workers, the critical infrastructures like homes,
Exactly.
not assets, now they are homes for self-isolation. They are visible. Workers are visible. Cleaners are visible. So my question is, this flip of visibility, what do you think will mean for the future organization and thinking about the cities, and also for the empowerment of the invisible sectors of the city?
Exactly. Well, this is excellent set of issues that you raise. And I am also very interested in seeing that. Now, I want to remind us that we have been there before. We have had crises that captured, the SARS, remember SARS? That captured the imagination of people, that altered their lives. It did so for a short period of time. And in the end, a kind of falling back to the familiar was part of the outcome, but also changes, sort of innovations, whatever. I'm having a very hard time thinking that somehow this crisis is going to have an outcome that works better for, say, modest income families. I have the impression that we're still in a cycle where extracting is operative. And so for me, the latest of these, which is in a way recent at this current scale, is the fact that some of the top financial firms, not your Macher, Macher, that expression, right, in some neighborhood, but fancy financial firms that deal with the most complex sort of formulas, that they are interested in modest housing complexes. That is alarming. That means that I'm afraid that we're sort of at the beginning of this particular extractive phase. Or my computer just moved in here. Oh my God, come on, what is this? That this extractive mode vis-a-vis what are ultimately, yes, big buildings full of modest income people, and I think this is going to grow more. This has not quite used its full potential to capture one big building after the other. So think of Berlin, where this is now very hot. Berlin is having a lot of trouble gaining, fighting these big buyers. So is New York, so is London. So I think we're at the beginning of this particular phase. We've gone through several phases, but we're at the beginning of this particular phase. Now, I don't know in your country how this works out, because maybe it's just a bit more civilized, it's just a bit more routinized. The story with cities like New York or London is that they become fields of assets, what we see as buildings, in the eyes of these operators, it's a field of assets. It's not about the buildings and it's not about housing. How much longer this can last, I don't know. But what I do know from having looked at long histories of financial operations, starting really after World War II, that they change, they innovate. It's a curve, it grows, 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 and then it goes down, 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 and then they have a new modality. So this notion of using these huge buildings for modest income people and transforming them in a highly desirable asset, that was a major innovation. But you know what? Eventually, they'll be done with it. And it doesn't mean all housing goes. It means something else. Did I answer your question?
I would, you did in a sense, but I would also like you to talk a little bit about these invisible sectors that are now visible. What do you mean that it means? For example, in United States, you have like food production that is mostly done by undocumented migrants, and now they are empowered. Even they are getting even some public support from the states. So now these invisible sectors in the cities are becoming visible.
Yeah.
Do you think that this has some potential for future like organizing or the future rethinking of the city?
I think you see these histories in our major cities. Across time, we have had these moments. Now, what you're describing, this moment of high visibility of certain types of workers, which has made visible the extent to which we, the comfortable, middle classes, totally depend on these types of workers. I don't know how long this will last, you see, because pretty soon the virus will have left us, and hence we will fall back into our comfort zones. But certainly I think that there is a kind of courage among those workers that are on which we're so dependent. And they have understood that this was a moment of extreme visibility of their importance to the life of a city, that they might really become, some of them at least, are going to become activists. We have seen this across history, that are certain historical moments when the invisible but needed workers of a city become actors, and they innovate, etc. It's not going to be all, because let's remember that most of these workers are exhausted. They don't have time to organize. They are super exploited. They are paid very little for a lot of hard work. They have to get up at 3 a.m. to bake those whatevers. And they're just dead tired. They have families, they have needs, they have mothers, they have grandmothers whom they have to take care of. If they didn't have all those added burdens, I think all our cities would be completely different, because they would be activists, there would be far more militants. But the system itself breaks them down a bit. They are exhausted. Look what is happening now with the nurses. I mean, where they have to spend hours and hours and hours, they are dead tired after that. So we also have to remember how there's a kind of really ugliness to this excessive abuse. Why? Because we don't have enough nurses, because we don't have enough of, and so we make the ones that are there work. So I don't know how long this moment lasts. In my reading of recent history, say starting after World War I, but also starting with an earlier period, we gain something. Organizations can function better than they used to, but it is partial, and sooner or later it is forgotten by the majority. So even though some elements will have gained something, luckily, how foundational the transformation can be, I'm afraid it's very often sort of limited. And that makes me very sad in many ways. I wish it were something far more radical. Now, you have a city like Berlin, one of the cities that I know. There are other such cities, but it's certainly one of the most famous cases, where a lot of the young people, mostly young people, also some old radicals, did manage to make a change, But in the end, look what Berlin is now. It's expensive. And that is sort of the shadow that hangs, over this. Even now, it's not yet totally visible, but eventually the grabbing side, I don't know if that language makes sense, wins.
But is there any way you see as a possibility or even some optimism how we could protect ourselves from this grabbing, from extracting? You know, in Slovenia, perhaps we don't see this often as a good thing, but maybe in this sense, it can be used as a good thing, that a lot of ownership is actually that individual households own their houses. So a lot is really, families own housing.
You have
this maybe
yeah
an opportunity here how we could somehow protect
yeah. Listen, I think that we have had better times than the current time. So if you look at all our major cities after World War II, there are a lot of modest families that managed to own their homes, little modest houses, etc. When I look at the current period, I see a lot of modest income families who have fallen in the grabs, if you want, of very powerful actors. So this whole, I think you saw, did you see the film Push? That documents all of it.
And we were kind of skeptic also of the optimism of Lelani. So this is why I'm also asking this question.
We need actors who are that way, who believe that something, we need that. But you also need people like me who know too much about the negatives. But you know, out of that, quand même, I will say, coming back to your question, the heart of your question, is that it is worth fighting for, even if the victories tend to be partial and often lose ground with time, but not always lose. Sometimes they really gain something. Now, one fact that hangs in there, when how our economies function vis-a-vis people is also important. So after World War II, we in the West, we needed a hell of a lot of workers, right? Of all kinds. Those who knew how to build, those who knew how to clean, those, etc., etc. I'm thinking now just Europe, Western Europe after World War II, etc., etc. So you have a massive amount of organizing that works well, etc., etc. We are past that particular moment in the West. You know, we have other conditions. And then what needs to happen, it seems, is again that workers have to mobilize. And it's going to be more difficult today than it was after World War II, when we needed those workers so desperately. I think what happens after the 1980s, in my reading, after the 1980s, when we globalize and deregulate, you know, in our Western economies, something very foundational was lost, something that we had. And it really becomes the domain of very powerful actors. Now, in there hangs, again, I think I mentioned it, the capabilities of brilliant minds, you know, this algorithmic math bit that I talked about, that, you know, via brilliant intelligence, basically physicists, you know how to transform a building into a field of assets. Now, I cannot blame the physicists for having made that possible, but that is what happens. So when our most brilliant minds are forced in a way to do this kind of stuff that again works to the advantage of the concentration of wealth and power, I think we're in trouble. Now, the question is whether the new generations that have completely different aims, which has to do with the environment, which has to do with clean air, which has to do with, it's not about owning the biggest possible fancy car that you can own, it's about bikes, you know, there is hope there. And so generation after generation has had its own way of contributing a transformation. And so I think that right now, it really is a transformation that is very centered in how we handle our environment. The environmental question is ascendant, I would say. And that is a good sign. Now, I have just been holding forth here But why don't we just stop and you ask me a few more questions, or I let you ask a few more questions.
Yeah, maybe also in correlation to the COVID, and you just talked about the rise of these powerful actors, which kind of correlated with the state losing its power, the national state. And we were wondering, maybe do you expect now that the state or the local communities will regain some of their power or some of their autonomy? Maybe is this maybe an opportunity also for the rise of localism, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I very much like that kind of possibility, you know, and I think some of that is happening. You know, every 20 or 30 years we sort of enter, or let me just rephrase that, a new type of systematicity, you know, modes of organizing, modes of making a system function enter the picture. And I think we have entered that. We have entered that partly via a new generation of young people who are not interested in having the biggest car, you know, all of that. But we've also entered it because of the climate change story, and, you know, because of a whole mix of innovations that come in play. And so I think we have entered that. What I cannot help but notice is how it can then be in turn, so much of that can be transformed into a grabbing operation, into more concentration of wealth. I think that this is a particularly brutal epoch that we're living through, where you look at all the nurses that are helping, you know, with the hospitals and all of that. They work day and night, day and night, day and night. You realize, my God, this is a complete abuse of these persons, you know, that we don't have enough nurses. So the question then is, are we going to make sure that we train far more nurses? And I don't know about doctors, but anyhow, nurses, let's just stick with nurses. Yes, we will do that. You know, there will be some positives that will come out. Will this actually change for instance, the housing question? I'm not sure. You know, it's like we have this one vector that captures our imagination, and then, but a lot of the rest is difficult to mobilize. Now, I think this has been a very interesting period that we are sort of on our own a bit, you know, for 10 days or 15 days or whatever it is. And we don't know what all will come up, what kinds of texts will be written, you know, what kinds of mobilizations will actually function. But I'm sure that something will come out of this. And I do also think that we have younger generations who are far more aware of the necessity of they being actors than, let's say, 30 years ago. You know, when you delegate it to the elders, so to say. I think we have now new generations which have seen the catastrophic outcomes of what some of this generation has done. And they say, hell no. And that is very reassuring, you know, that you have this, the elders have lost power. The elders, in other words, the ones who have the knowledge, the one that whatever, they have lost power because we have made a mess out of it. Since World War II, we have done a few good things, but we have basically made, in the eyes of many of the youth, I'm not saying all, because there are many youth that they are so poor, so hungry that they can't focus on these kinds of issues. But I think it's considerable, you know, sort of the modest middle classes, let's say, and the middle classes. You have young people there who have a completely different view from, say, my generation, you know, older people. So that is, to me, extraordinarily important. And the environmental question hangs in there very seriously. And this virus has become a key actor in this play. It enables a certain type of analysis, critical analysis that many of these young people have had, that now is out there, you know, it's like the evidence. Now, I'm talking far too much.
Oh,
but maybe,
sorry.
yeah,
I would like to maybe directly connect to that. You were mentioning like the shifts in like systems modalities and like these different vectors. And certainly I think one of the kind of modalities that we here would like to like aspire towards or see in the world is a kind of conceptualization of housing as a commons, institutionalized form of participatory city making, and kind of introducing open source principles to that, which at least in part, I think you covered in your open source urbanism concept. So maybe in relation to the ecological crisis, could you maybe say something more about those approaches?
Well, I mean, the first point I would like to make, and I agree with what the way you just described it right now, is also that there is an enablement in play. Enablement is that clear language, right? In the current condition, which needs to be seized on more broadly and with more awareness and with more projecting what it means. This is a very peculiar moment. And in that sense, histories can be made, new histories can be made. You will always have serious enemies who are not dressed in the clothing of enemies, but the way the system works, the money-making issues, etc. But you also have a whole vast number of new types of generations that that simply have a different program in mind. And that is important, you know, the fact that young people have a different concept of what needs to be done that goes against a lot of the sort of the grabbers, you know, the kinds of actors that just want to make more and more money. I find that a lot of the young people today, they're not interested in money. You know, money is not the driver. The driver is something very different. The driver is having a lot of trees, having bikes, not having all those cars out there, having, you know, sort of, and so I'm not talking about those who are absolutely super activists. I'm just talking about your average young person, you know, who might be a right winger in her politics. You know what I'm saying, right? But still, she wants a bike. She wants biking path. She wants green, etc., right? She wants healthy food. Well, all of that, those are little micro trajectories, you know, that move into all kinds of other types of systems from what was the case that we saw in after World War II with the emergent middle classes. You know, it was a total, so we have these young people without being necessarily activists. I mean, some are activists, but many are not, but they just have better preferences, is one very modest way to put it, than my generation, which was ridiculous. You know, you want 2 cars. These young people now, they don't want a car. A car is a hassle. I don't want a car either. I've never had a car. I think it's such a hassle, you know. So, but you know, these are really transformative things at the level of a city. And I mention this because this is a simple way of capturing the way urban space can make a difference with certain types of actors, even though those actors are not militant, not brilliant, they don't have grant projects, but they don't want, let's say, to own a car. They don't want to, certainly to own 2 cars, just as, you know, this play. Now, this is very much an American story, the notion that houses had to have 2 cars to be proper middle-class houses, which is of course ridiculous. But I think Americans have also gotten over that a bit. But I don't, now ask me more questions. I realize I just keep talking. So you have to interrupt me.
No, that's perfectly okay. Yeah, I just wanted to maybe circle back to the question. It also comes from like the trends of permanent, either temporary or permanent nationalizations of certain hitherto privatized systems in the UK and in Spain and elsewhere. So I was just thinking this is a very interesting like point of reference to be thinking about or coalescing around, you know, alternatives to basic income in terms of like, you know, a basic universal basic assets and services and deliberative frameworks to kind of actually define that, co-create that and distribute that. So I thought your concept of open source urbanism which addresses this at various levels, would be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Europe is a better space, operational space, if you want, for launching these types of initiatives. And launching is not even the word. They are sort of emergent, number one, but number two, in some ways they have long existed in most European cities, sort of a reasonable understanding of what is a city. And you cannot say that about London, about New York, you know, they are, or even Paris, all the very big cities are a bit out of control. Now, Paris is an interesting case, you know, the 15 minutes, we all know about this, right? So the notion of the mayor of Paris, with whom I speak in Spanish, by the way, I grew up in Latin America and she is from Spain. And she has created this notion that Paris should be full of 15-minute elements. In other words, that wherever you are in that city, you can walk to buy, to go to the doctor, to whatever it might be. Now, she cannot transform Paris completely, but as a concept and as a partial possibility of installing that kind of thinking. And it has been a great success. You know, people love the concept. We nowadays know enough about our bodies that we know that walking is fantastic. It's not just healthy, it's just a great experience to walk rather than to sit in a car or whatever. So you have these micro transformations that are possible. I mean, the European context enables that partially in a way that, say, the United States is just out to lunch. You know, it's just out to lunch is an expression. It's not literally. We all do lunch, but in that sense, how Europe was constituted, a lot of small cities, turns out to be an enormous advantage compared to how, you know, the Latin America and North America, this notion of huge cities, and Asia also, of course, right? So, I mean, what is difficult for me to see is how the vast cities in Asia, the vast cities in Latin America, that end in disaster zones. You know, they are just absolutely not functional for about half of the population in the cities. How do we exit those modes? I mean, one way in which the exiting is happening is death. You know, those are people who sleep like 2 hours a night in Latin America. You know, poor people, they die young. So that's one way in which the population is reduced and there's a bit more space for the next set of poor people. That is, we thought we were past that mode. You know, we associate that with the early whatevers, but not now. And so when you look at the world at large, you see two things. One is European cities, they are just the exception. You are really and you of course, you have increasingly also some very big cities where you have a lot of poor people, a lot of homeless, and Paris and London are examples of that. But the rest of the world has a mode that is truly problematic. I don't see how we make an end to that. We have more and more people, and I do think that this kind of virus that we have right now, you know, which is killing people, I wonder to what extent this is going to recur more often because it's a way of just sorting out, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to say too much about this, but Europe has an advantage here that much of the West and much of Asia does not. Africa still has a possibility in many of its places, not in all clearly, but still. But the way the United States has organized itself, it's pretty disastrous. The way Sao Paulo functions is a disaster. You know, major cities. What I don't see anytime soon is how do we truly transform that? How do we create enough cities small cities that people can leave these extraordinary, you know the image that I have, right? Like for Sao Paulo is a very good example. You know, it's disastrous. Is that what you wanted me to address, or was there the positive side that you wanted me to also pick up on?
Was going towards the positive, but
well, the positive is very important, and I think young generations, just by not wanting cars, already are making a difference. But it will take much more than that. And you have these new types of actors who are seeing in, as I said, in modest income housing, an investment option. That is not good news. So there is a battle at hand. And I mean, look, I just want as background say that most cities are small cities and they function okay. Actually, they're pretty good. I have focused particularly on the big cities. In the big cities, I would say they have wonderful elements, but they also are very problematic. They're problematic vis-a-vis climate issues. They're problematic vis-a-vis housing questions. You know, they're problematic. How we get out of it, I think one of the things that I always say is we need to build far more cities. And soffresune, you know, the famous expression, moderate cities, not the Sao Paulos, you know, not even the New Yorks. New York has a huge, you know, New York is not just Manhattan. We need to build more cities, you know, so that you can have the urban residents as actors that make the city, rather than desperate people who have to hang in there just so that they can have food and, you know, some protection, etc. This is a very bad model, and it is a dominant model in much of the world. I mean, again, Europe is really different.
Do you think that current epidemic could be a factor with reorganization of cities and space? Like, for example, cholera did in 19th century, which was a huge factor for the first like urban hygiene, so public intervention into hygiene and clean water and stuff like that. And the main reason was that cholera was killing also the rich. They couldn't get out of it. And here we have also virus that is infecting Boris Johnson and Prince Charles and people like that. And the main factor for this virus is the density, the flows, international flows into the cities. So the globalization, as you said, that localization of the global flows. So do you think that this particular epidemic, which is not the only one, we will probably have more in the future because of our dealings with nature, can be one of the pushes into the direction of more dispersed city conditions, let's say?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. I think yes, I think it is an instrument. You know, it's an instrumentality that we can use. And I'm just afraid that too many people just see it as 100% negative. And they just want to go back to their good old lives, you know. But I do think that, and history shows us also that, I mean, one of the reasons that cities have had these extraordinarily long lives, century after century after century after century, is adaptation to new modes. Now, I would say after World War II, we entered a terrible mode, you know, a mode that has not worked well in many ways for vis-a-vis how we handle the environment. But we have young generations who are really keen on this, and changes are being made. And even the top managerial operations of a city who may not care at all about the environmental question are forced to recognize, you know, and certainly in functioning cities. I mean, let's remember that we have a lot of cities that are dirt poor across the world, and that is a different story. But let's say us in the West, to make it shorter. I think we see signs in many municipal governments that they are aware of having to correct the modes in which they have worked, buses that are clean air buses, you know, you see it in a vast array of very small interventions. And And I think we need to celebrate that more, you know, because most people are not even aware of this. They aren't aware that now we have clean buses. You know, when I was younger, we didn't have clean buses. Now we have clean buses, but it's an invisible event, you know. And so I wish that there were a more collective understanding of how small differences have mattered, even if we're still stuck with major challenges that we at this point do not seem to have the proper instruments to address, but that we have made already a small difference. And often it is a new generation that demands, like the fact that young people now want to do bikes. You know, a lot of these people want bikes. We have bike lanes, you know, in some cities at least, etc. And so now the problem is that it is not enough. You know, how do we radicalize? Can this current, like one of you raised the question earlier, can this current situation we're in with this virus, coronavirus, can that actually take us a step further? I think it can, I think it will, but it will be just a step. It will not be a revolution. And the question then for me is the mode of revolution, if you think of revolution just as in its simplest meaning, a foundational transformation, just that understanding, is that foundational transformation nowadays only possible with many small interventions, you know, rather than truly you break down, you know, when the Romans were hit by the whatever, you know, I mean, and then you run the risk that many people will say, oh, let them do it. You know, I'm not going to change my mode, because we see that all the time. So you know, I don't know, but all I know is that the new generations, many different ages here already, by now, that there are at least very significant actors who want to change things. And it's not like post-World War II, when everybody was so happy. We had houses and we had little gardens and we had cars, you know, that no, this is not a naive period. The intelligence is in play, the demands. There is enough knowledge, enough awareness of the destructions and all of that, that it offers a possibility. Who are the baddies? You didn't ask me that. Who are the baddies in this? You know, the bad ones. You know what I mean by baddies? It's not bads, It's, well, it's an ambiguous mix. It's not just people. I think our main obstacle is not people, not the rich. It's what we have built so far, how we have built it, what it means that we need. We have built in ways that are basically extractive. We need to extract. We need particular types of this. From all the world we extract. So that is what we confront. And we have to find new ways. So when you look, for instance, at the brilliant stuff, you know, that is happening with digital. Yeah, it's brilliant. But digital garbage is a major issue. You know, now we also have people who are working at diminishing digital garbage, making the digital produce less garbage, or using that garbage for something. But that's where we're at. I mean, those are the challenges we confront, where we don't hear enough people talking about, you know, we're going to do it this way or that way. You know, so I think it will begin to happen, you know, because. But it means that we really have to innovate on a whole range of things. And that for me is the incoming generation, certainly with the digital being so ascendant. You know, most young people now know about digitization, even in very poor areas, they know a bit about it. They know it exists. And that could make a difference, even if it is just at the level of communicating and sharing knowledge, you know. I have this image always of the poor. I have long argued in my work here in New York, and I'm here in London, but in my work in New York, that the poor neighborhoods, so I did quite a few analyses, etc., and suggestions, that the poor neighborhoods, one thing they really should all have is good digital instruments, because that allows them to learn what other groups are doing. There should be transversal communication between low-income neighborhoods, across a country, across countries, that they learn. There is because we know from little studies done by anthropologists that there is a kind of knowledge in many poor neighborhoods that we could also use. Now I'm thinking now of the global South. In other words, fairly extreme conditions where you don't have the kind of communication systems that we have in the West, let's say, in much of the world now. So the knowledge function is not just what happens in the rich West, in the academies. There are other knowledges, and we need those knowledges desperately. I've written about this. We need those knowledges that every plant has a hidden kind of something in it. I'm pointing to my plants here. You can't see my balcony has a lot of plants here. There is knowledge in all of those plants. And we know that there are peoples who have known how to use that knowledge and keep those plants alive across the centuries, right? So there is a whole world of knowledge functions that we in the West, we in general, I mean, the so-called advanced economies, that we have not done enough, is one way of putting it. Do you think that we have sort of done it? I don't mean the knowledge, I mean me talking.
One more question. Right now, it looks as though that if we want to gain more mobility, more freedom to move around, it looks as though that they will want to put these apps on our phones and trace us wherever we go. So do you think that this is something we should accept? And what are maybe the implications of having such a technology? And maybe you can
this is a big issue because we are already deeply tracked, maybe not as much as the Chinese have managed to do. But frankly, I'm fine with what the Chinese have done. I must say, I'm not one of those super critics of what the Chinese have done. But I think in the West, it's a bit different, I think, from China. I may be wrong there. You don't have to agree with me. But the West is marked by major actors who are so extraordinarily grabby. You know the term grabby? Grabby is not a proper word, but who grab, extract. One of the big negatives of our current condition is that a lot of instruments that by themselves could be enablers for a very broad range of people are functioning as extraction tools. And our big firms often do that. This is when you see that every innovation has that other side, which can be a negative. This has become this to me is a very serious issue of the current condition. This notion of extracting, even when you don't know how you're going to use it, but you might want to use it at some point. That creates a distortion in almost any of our ways of using, these technologies. And I think a lot of that is going to go nowhere, but a lot of it is going to make a difference. And I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question. But
and maybe just to pick your brain on something that we have been struggling here in Slovenia a lot, because basically at the same time that Corona started, we also got a far-right government again. And so we have the need to protest, but there's no way to go do it on the streets. So do you think that there's a form of protest that could be as powerful as, or something similar to that, it could have some impact?
Yeah. Well, the street is a very, I have written about the street, just the street, because the street. Pardon?
It was a notification. I apologize.
The street is a very special type of space, you know, and with enormous variety, etc. But I think that there are always going to be some humans who will not accept a dictatorship, who will not accept the destruction of something, you know, the fighting spirit, the fighting for what you know is the right thing. Now, you know, here I put in quotation marks, but mostly they are very decent people, right? But they can also get it wrong. One of the vectors for me in play, which we have not touched on, is that the digital has both enabled enormously certain groups. I know of very isolated, poor indigenous groups that now can communicate. They can get information about this and that, you know, et cetera, good things. But we also know that it renders us passive. Many people become passive consumers who before would have been makers, making something. Now they just consume. And that goes for young people, poor and rich. I'm not talking just about. So these modalities, they really are a spectrum. So on the one hand, you have a lot of positives that can enable, people can organize, people, you know, there are, I mean, all kinds of good things. And on the other hand, there are negatives. And it's just not easy to navigate all of those options. You know, we really have to develop greater skills, we humans, to navigate the many vectors in play with a given X, a given technology, a given option, a given mode of building, whatever the X might be. You know, we think of one modality, no, there are many, many. And so in there also hang possibilities of using what now is a negative in a positive way. But we might never get there. You know, there is a kind of a work to be done of disassembling and not just simply labeling something that's a negative is a negative is a negative. No, in that negative, there might be actually something positive. And it would be good for us to use that positive, you know, to develop whatever the bridge into that positive. Am I making myself clear or not? In other words, right now, the dominant actors in everything that is the digital are, one could say, very powerful and grabby. They want it for themselves. They want to extract what is to be extracted. They don't necessarily sit there and think, how can we help poor neighborhoods? If there is nothing there for them in it, they're not going to bother with that. You know, so it's what we're really living with are the to a very large extent, extractive modes. That's my reading. You know, there's a lot of extracting with instruments that could also enable the disadvantaged, enable the weaker parties, enable, and that enabling part is not done enough. That enabling part can consist of very simple moves that can certainly happen in small cities. Big cities is always a bit more difficult. But they can also happen, you know, in terms of we set up a food production assembly, you know, that it just takes a kind of collaborative effort, a mix of intelligences that I would say this modernity we are living in and with has not enabled. The knowledge, the how do we make it resides too strongly, and it makes us passive in having all the needed systems in play. You know, rather than like after World War II, you know, when Europe was very poor, they had to innovate. They had, because every bit of food mattered, etc., whatever, you know. And right now, we have delegated too much to operational systems, to brilliant instruments, to, that's all great. But we should also try to say, what are the many different ways in which I can use technology X or an existing, say, assembly or group network? You know, how can we make more use of what we already have but we're not using enough. And I mean it, of course, on positive vectors. Mafia is doing that all the time, but you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm explaining myself here, but we need to make more with what we have than we do now. We have delegated a bit too much to systems. And in that modality, we are at risk of reducing the need for ourselves and for others of our intelligence. You know, the kind of passivity, there's the risk of a passivity. Whereas these are tools that could actually act, and they also do, you know, we already also have the positives that can really activate, mobilize, engender whole new ways of understanding. How do I succeed at task X? How do I organize, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, so to put it very, very briefly, if there is one risk that we run, very easily, that could happen to us very easily, this risk, it's passivity. That we have delegated too much of our intelligence, our initiatives, our ways of imagining to existing systems that just function fantastically well. You know? It used to be that we had to elaborate certain instruments in a way that was far more complicated than now. Now a machine can do it, you know, and so that we cannot do that. We want to then, if the machine is really, really good, we want to then bring our intelligence in to say, God, look, we could do all of this also, not just what the maker of the machine told us it was good for, but all these other things as well. Why don't we end on that very nice note?
I think that's an excellent proposition and an excellent choice of words, I think, for this ending. Well, here I also saw we got some questions in the live stream, but I think we covered a lot of this in our conversation already. So I think it's okay if we leave it at that. And thank you so much, Saskia, for joining us, and Maša and Klemen as well, for contributing and also helping all of us prepare for this talk.
It was a pleasure, and thank you to you all for being so well prepared. Great questions.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. So we check out.
Yeah.